Okay, so if no more questions about the knobs, we're going to switch now to focusing on the buttons. 8 buttons left to right, 1 through 8, don't count the knob. So how do those buttons work? Well, let me describe to you the functions they do, and then we're going to step in and out of all the different menus. So the first and most obvious function of the buttons is to select menus. Across the bottom, you have a label above each one of those buttons. And most of those labels refer to submenus. And so try this on button 1. It should say PFD. If you press PFD, the only change you should see is that the menu itself changes, and you're now looking at the PFD menu. So anyhow, you press that button, it selects the menu. How do you think you get back to that main menu? Well, look at button 1. Its assignment changed. Press button 1 again, and it takes you back to the main menu. You're going to experience that more in a minute. Now, there are some buttons, don't wander around too much for me, Bob. There's some buttons that will actually cause an action to be performed. Imagine if we were on the transponder menu, then there's a button that says ident. What does it do? You press that button, the menu doesn't change, it just does its ident thing. Later on, you're going to see me change the screen layout. I like the flight instruments on the right and the engine on the left. There's buttons to change the way the screen is laid out. Now, button 1, I said it's back. Here's an interesting thing. How many of you have seen the movie Hitch with Will Smith? Do you know this movie? No? Just one? Oh, this is going to go badly. But we're going to forge ahead anyhow. So in this movie, Will Smith, his name is Hitch, and he's a dating coach. Guys like, well, a couple of you, would hire him to say, hey, I got a crush on this gal, and I want to make her fall in love with me. So how do I get her to do that? Because I pass her in the hallway at work or on the street, and she doesn't even glance at me. How do I get her to fall in love with me? So they pay Hitch a lot of money. He's got a lot of great ideas. One of the things he says is, hey, you know what? Girls love men who dance. So show me how you dance. And his client is an actor named Kevin James. Kevin starts dancing, and he's a horrible dancer, not unlike myself. He's got this move called the Q-tip. Use a Q-tip and throw it away. Use the Q-tip. See, this is all going on film. I'm embarrassed. Anyhow, so Will says, you know what? That dancing is not going to attract the girl of your dreams. So here's the deal. This is it, baby. This is home. This is where you live. This is home. Okay? Now, hopefully you're snapping in time with the music, but this is all I want to see. This is home. So you're all saying, well, what the heck does that have to do with the menus in SkyView? I hope you're saying that. Could be worse. If I wanted to lean the engine, you're going to learn that there's a lean assist mode. So what do? I look at the menu, and is there anything down there that's even remotely related to engine? Anything in there that says I hope it's not off. I don't want to turn the engine off. No. If there's nothing in there that seems to be related to the engine in terms of context, look at button 1. It almost always says back. There's a couple exceptions, but usually it says back. So what are you going to do? Bob's going to reach up and press button 1, and he's going to take me home. So this is your home menu. And the finger snapping, does the name Pavlov ring a bell? Right? I'm just trying to give you an auditory clue to get back to the home menu. So how do you know you're on the home menu? Button 1 will say PFD if you're on the home menu. Almost always. Now there's one exception I'm going to show you real quick. Don't follow along, but I'm just going to change something real quick. If I have turned off the primary flight instruments, the PFD, then there's no reason for me to give you access to that menu. So we remove that menu item from the screen. If you only have one SkyView display, you probably won't do this, I hope. But anyhow, so an absolute reference for the home menu is button 7. If button 7 says screen, you are absolutely at the home menu. It's the only time it says that, and it will always say screen on the home menu. The reason I don't teach that as the reference is simply because we tend to read left to right, so I like to use button 1. So the rest of this next session, if I start clicking my fingers, you need to get yourself back to the home menu. Okay, so now, here's the copy of the main menu up on my screen, and we're going to step in and out of each one of those menus. I'm going to talk about them in a little bit of detail. And a couple of them I'm going to say we're going to come back a little later and go in much more detail. But I want you to now step in and out of these menus in sequence with me. So starting with PFD, press the PFD button. And don't press anything else for a minute. The first thing you need to recognize is that all of those buttons are black. And since they're black, you can't tell whether they represent another submenu, a feature, an action. You just don't know, so you have to try them out by ear, trial and error. So press button 2 labeled G-meter. And what do you see happen when you press that button? Well, first thing you should notice is the button label itself turns gray. And by the way, the G-meter appeared above the overlaid on the directional gyro. Notice, however, the gray button. If you see a gray menu item on SkyView, gray tells you that that's an on-off feature, something you can turn on and off, and gray is the on condition. So we've turned the G-meter on, right? And if you press that button again, it'll turn it off. Yep. So back on with the G-meter for a moment. Now look at my big screen and I'll show you what the G-meter does. Have you all flown with the G-meter? Anyone?
Yep.
You have an idea what it does, right? So on my big screen, the needle is pointing to the current instantaneous G's. If I'm straight and level, that needle is going to point there, and the big number in the middle says 1.0 G's. That's the normal state of affairs, right? If I pitch up, the needle climbs, the number goes up, and so on. What are those small numbers above and below? Those are limit values, or not limits, they are the recording of the highest positive G and the lowest negative G you achieved since when? There's a button here that says reset G's, since the last time you pushed this button. So if Bob presses that button, it flashes, so there's an action button, it just flashed, didn't change the menu, and it reset those numbers. I call those RV numbers, not RV12, but the rest of you RV pilots, those are RV numbers. Why? Because when you come back from flying, you say, hey, Ted, check this out. I pulled 4.7 G's before I blacked out. Right? That's how the RV goes. You know the Blackjack Squadron, right? Yeah, okay. So anyhow, that's what that was about. Now, the red and yellow zones, you define those in the setup. You say, well, for my aircraft, and hopefully they're related to the structural limits in the aircraft, yellow zone and white zone, you define those in setup. What happens if you go into the yellow zone? Well, maybe I should slow down to maneuvering speed, at least, right? Now, Bob, turn off the G-meter for me. He's going to turn it off. Now, what if I'm a particularly ham-fisted pilot? We put ourselves in a descent here. Oh, G-meter popped up. Why did it do that? I exceeded some limit. Hopefully, I didn't exceed the yellow and red zones. Those, especially the red zone, that would be bad. But you also have the ability to define what we call pop-up limits. And those are values you set to say if the G's experienced by the airplane exceed those values, momentarily display the G-meter as a reminder, right? And hopefully you set those limits something below where you black out or gray out and below the structural limits. Just a quick reminder, hey, pay attention. Again, I would set them in proximity maybe to the yellow zone, so if I'm cruising along and it starts to get bumpy, the G-meter starts popping up, slow down to maneuvering speed, right? And in the headset, by the way, if you have the audible alerts connected and turned on, you're going to hear in your headset, G's, right? How do you think we spell that? Is it G''S or maybe it's J-E-E-Z? I don't know. Geez, that was a big bump. Okay. So we're back on the main menu, or on the PFD menu. Let's look at button 3 mode. Now what do you see here? Well, you see a couple gray buttons, so those are on-off items, right? SynViz. What happens if you push SynViz and turn that off? The synthetic terrain goes away, right? Don't do that. Don't do that. Why? Well, some of you are saying, now, you know what? That just looks familiar to me. I can't express how important synthetic vision is. You might think it's a nuisance. You will quickly acclimate, and I firmly believe it might save your life. I know for a fact it helps reduce my susceptibility to motion sickness and spatial disorientation. You're just going to have to trust me till you experience it. If you press the wide button, that's an on-off feature. It's kind of hard to perceive, but it changes how wide a view of the world do we depict with synthetic vision. Now look at these two, EFIS, Electronic Flight Information System. That's a standard acronym, Electronic Flight Information System, and that generally refers to the flight instruments. And it's gray. Can you turn it off? What happens if you press the EFIS button? Will it turn off? No. Well, what if you push the button next to it, 6-pack? Now that one turns gray. So now the 6-pack is turned on, the EFIS turned off. So those are like, it's like a rocker switch. One side's on, then the other's off, and vice versa. Okay, so those are just one of them's turned on at a time. When Bob chooses 6-pack, we change from the tape displays to the traditional round instrument layout. Okay, now I'll show you more we're going to discuss the tape details in the tape presentation in much greater detail. I'm not going to spend any time today telling you how to read round dial instruments. I will show you real quickly. I'm going to jump out of the menu for a moment. I want to change the layout of the screen for a moment just to show you when the flight instrument page is defined 50% or wider, then the instruments are aligned like a normal 6-pack. If I scrunch it down by adding other things to the screen, then that's where we get that kind of chevron layout just because of space limitations. So some of you are saying, well, that's great. I want to use the 6-pack because that's more familiar to me. How about you? Does that look more familiar? During first flight, phase 1, if it helps you transition to using this system to see familiar round dials, then by all means. Because anything that makes you more confident in the cockpit also probably makes you more competent, safer pilot. But there are some really compelling reasons why you need to try and transition away from the round dials. There's a very important analog feature called the flight path marker I'll show you later. And that feature is not available when you're using the 6-pack. So if you want to use the 6-pack presentation early on when you're acclimating yourself to using SkyView, great, please do that. But I really need to encourage you to transition yourself to the tape display, not because tapes are inherently better, but because of other features that are then accessible to you. Now let's turn the EFIS back on, Bob, on my menu. Now what do I need? I need you to go back, right? But it doesn't take me all the way back to the main menu because we were a 3rd layer deep in the menu system. Now that's another interesting fact about SkyView. We worked very hard to limit the number of layers that you go down into the menus because it can be confusing. So it's extremely rare that you can go any more than a 3rd layer deep in our menus. And in other systems, that's not the case. One company recently came out with a touch display that's very heavily dependent on the touch interface. And if you investigate their menu system, you'll see that you can drill in, you can be in 3, 4, 5 menus deep in some places. Not saying that's necessarily bad, but in general, more complexity, more layers, it makes a system somewhat more challenging to learn and use. Now, the next 3 buttons on here, I don't want you to press them just now. The middle one says HSI source. That obviously refers to the HSI. The directional gyro can be an HSI, horizontal situation indicator. That's the button we're going to use later on today to choose what source is putting information on the HSI needle. Some of you had multiple sources. You'll use that button there. The other 2 on either side, bearing 1 and bearing 2, our electronic HSI can have additional needles, bearing 1 and bearing 2, they're different colors. They can give you some information to the same sources that your primary needle can, but they only give you relative bearing information. Remember the old ADF needle? Or for commercial pilots, an RMI? If you select a source to either of one of these buttons, the needle is always going to swing and just point relative bearing to the station. For VFR flying, you're probably not going to use that. If any of you IFR guys want to know about that, I'll show you that later during a break. The last item on this says bugs. I'm going to skip this feature completely. I'm going to refer you back to the manual if you want to know what that does. Okay? Got to leave some work for you to do, some homework, right? So where do I need you to go? Back to the main menu. Back home. Okay, that was a PFD menu. Next is button 2, engine. Choose that one. Not a lot of stuff on this menu, but I'll go through them real quick. Button 3 says lean. Now SkyView has what we call a lean assist mode. What does that mean? Well, press the button and turn that on. So when you turn that button on, it turns gray, so you know whatever that feature is doing, it's on. And if you look on the engine page below the cylinder head temperatures, this label comes on, says lean. So we got a tech support call, and the guy says, hey Kirk, the lean assist mode just doesn't work, flat doesn't work. Really? Well, when you push the button, does it turn gray? Yeah. Do you have this little yellow label? Yeah. Well, what's the problem? He says, well, my EGTs never change. The EGT temperatures are just staying fixed. I said, gee, do you have a red knob on your instrument panel? Give that a tug. Pull that mixture knob out and see what happens. So the point is, the lean assist mode doesn't lean the engine for you. We don't have any way to control your mixture. Some of you don't even have mixture control, so you're not going to use this in your Rotax engines. But you've flown airplanes with a mixture, right? Nothing happens unless you pull that. So the lean assist mode doesn't lean the engine for you. It changes the way we monitor the EGTs, and we can alert you which cylinder reached its peak temperature first and when did it do that. Okay. So I've got slides at the very end of the day that will show you how the lean assist mode works. But based on the response there, I'm not sure I even want to tell you. I don't know. Okay, button 6 says fuel. Press that, and you'll see a little dialog pop up. Now, close that. The rest of you can leave it open. Bob's going to close it for a moment by pressing the cancel button. First of all, here we have tank indicators, fuel level indicators that get information directly from your fuel tank. And as the flow goes up or down, right, they change. Separately, SkyView has a built-in fuel computer. Where does it get its data from? Not from the tanks. It gets its data from a fuel flow transducer. It's just a little water wheel or a hamster wheel inline in your fuel system. As the fuel flows down there, the wheel spins. It says, you're consuming fuel at. That's, by the way, that's where we get the fuel flow indication too, is from how quickly that spins. The two systems are intended to be independent, separate indicators of your fuel state. So they don't automatically talk to each other. So now at the end of the flight, I pull up to the fuel pump. As I start pumping fuel in the tank, these indicators will go up, right? The fuel computer, and you don't even see the data from the fuel computer. We'll talk about that near the end of the day. There's text values you add to your engine page that show you this is how many gallons the fuel computer thinks you've consumed, and this is how many gallons it thinks it's on board. So as we're adding fuel to the tank, the sensor level sensors go up, but the fuel computer, if it said you had 10 gallons left, it still says 10 gallons. So how do you reset the computer? That's what this menu does. When you press the fuel button, the computer says, how much do you want me to adjust by? Now he says, currently I think you have 38 gallons. And I said the computer won't talk to the tanks. In reality, in your airplane, it's not working right because of flight simulator. In your airplane, if you have fuel tank sensors, this value would also be filled in. And in my example here, it should say 49 gallons, 24 and a half in each gallon in each tank. So if you add those up, that's 49 gallons. So you would expect to see that value here. But it's informational only. It's just a way of telling you how much your tanks think you have on board. But we need to change this number. We need to tell the computer how much fuel is on board. So there's 3 or 4 ways to do that. One is full. If Bob pushes that button, full. Press that for me. Button 3, full. Now in this case, 38 gallons is already been defined for this airplane as the full fuel state. In my mall, full fuel was 72 gallons. So when I press full, regardless of what the tank says, if I press the full button, this number goes to 78 or 72 in my airplane. Whatever it is in your airplane. You only have one tank in the RB12, 15 gallons? What?
19.8.
19.8. So when you push that button, that should go to 19.8. This number, by the way, will go to whatever value is necessary to get the computer from what it thought it had to the new value. So if you were at 10 and you push full, then this would go to plus 9.8 to get the... See, it's just math, right?
You have to have the engine module to make that all out.
Yep, have to have the engine module for that to function. Now, what if I press preset? You remember flying the Cessna 152 and you got a great big instructor, you can't carry full fuel. So they filled the fuel up where? To the bottom of the tabs in the tank, and then it could hold, I don't remember what it was, 13 gallons or 9 gallons or whatever it was. So those two values you define in system setup, what's full fuel for your airplane, and if you have a way to reference a partial fuel load like the bottom of the filler neck, or you have 4 tanks and when only the mains have fuel, then your partial fuel load, your preset value is that. And again, going back to my mall, I had 72 gallons in full fuel and what did I have, 48 or something in just my mains. That would be my preset value. Okay? There's a button that's missing here, again, because of the way the simulator works. If there was a value populated here, remember, this airplane thinks it has 49 gallons on board. There should be a button here that says match. And in that case, pressing that would say, well, if your tank says you have 49 and you think that's right, pressing that will automatically set this number to 49. It still requires your action to make the match. So it's not doing it automatically. It's just saying, if you want me to say this is the value, I'll match that. And then there's one last way to change the value, and that is, my wife gave me my flying allowance for the weekend. She gave me 20 bucks. So how many gallons do I get to put in with $20? Not very many. Whoop. So here's where we started. We were at 0 when we came in here. Now, if I wasn't already at full, as I rotate the knob, this number would go up until I got to 3 or 3.3 gallons or whatever I put in. Okay? So those are 4 different methods to change this value, current fuel computer quantity. Once you've adjusted that number, you would press button 1 to accept. What's that?
It says fuel over the knob. It shows fuel. The button is not.
Oh, yes. Yep. Bob was pointing out that in this context, the right knob has the label fuel to tell you if you twist that knob, that's how you're incrementing the value in the white box. Okay, so however we got there, we arrived at 38 gallons. Now we're going to press button 1 to accept. Did everybody understand that? This is something you have to go through a few times to really get. And you have to do it religiously every time you fill up the tanks. If you forget to reset the fuel computer, then it's not doing its job of telling you your fuel state. This last button, if you push it, it'll flash for you. All you need to know about that, clear timers, that's what it stands for. The system has a whole bunch of different timers: tack time, Hobbs time, flight time, trip time. Some of those timers never get reset, tack and Hobbs, right? They run continuously. Some of them, like a trip timer, well, a flight timer resets every time you turn SkyView on because it recorded yesterday's flight. Then there's a trip timer. It's like the trip meter in your car. It won't ever reset until you do what? You push a button. So this is the button, just like the one on your dashboard. When you push that, it resets the trip timers. And you're saying, where are the timers? End of the day, I'll show you a screenshot that shows you the timers on screen. Okay, so we're done talking about the engine menu, and where do I need you to go? Back to the main menu. So Bob's going back there. Now next we're going to talk about the map menu. So press button 3. Now we'll step quickly into the various map submenus. And remember, later in the day we're going to circle back and I'll go into more detail about how to do flight planning and that kind of thing. But right off the bat, I hope you'll see that many of those labels look familiar to you. You know what the D with the arrow through it means? Direct to. So if you press that, somehow you're going to tell the computer to go direct to somewhere. Okay, so when you press the direct to button, what happens? Well, it doesn't automatically draw a course line. You're going to have to tell it where to go direct to. And there's going to be lots of ways to do that. And to understand that, we need to go through some of the other menus.
Question for you. In
Sure,
this
Paul.
Nearest menu I'm looking at, I'm seeing seaplane facilities.
Paul is saying in his list of nearest airports, will you go back to the airport list? He's seeing airports that are characterized as seaplane bases. I'm guessing you've got fixed wheels.
There's not enough air in my tires.
Right, not enough air in his tires, so he's not going to use a seaplane base. There are ways to filter that information out. And notice, here, once you've selected the nearest list, this button says filter, and it's gray. So whatever filters are defined or turned on, if we press that button and turn those off, the filter is unapplied. I'm not going to cover how to set that filters in here today. It's in the manual, and you need to spend some time with it. Basically, there's a screen where you go and say, when I turn on my filter, I want to only see land airports. I only want to see airports that are longer than 3,000 feet. I don't want to see any unimproved strips, things like that. You define those filter characteristics, and then you can either turn the filter on or off. Now, in my mall, I want to land it anywhere. But if I need to get fuel, I need to go someplace with facilities, so maybe I could define that as a filter. Or as an analog, I might say, okay, take me only to the airports with 3,000 feet or longer, because they're more likely to have fuel. Things like that.
Okay, you set multiple filters.
Just one filter. Does that make sense, Paul? Did that answer it?
Yes.
Okay, so that was the nearest tab. Now we currently on our screen have pane field, KPAE is highlighted. If you press button 4, info, that's going to take us to the info screen. Now I'm going to circle back and talk about this in a few more slides, but through this screen we can get access to all of the information about an airport that you would otherwise find in the airport facilities directory. And by the way, you can also see, if you've subscribed to the chart data set I talked about, instrument procedures and taxi diagrams, those would be accessible through that tab that says charts. Again, I'm going to show you some slides on that in a little later. What does FPL stand for? Flight plan. Right. And if you press that button, you would see a list of your active flight plan. Now, I have an interesting flight plan defined in here right now. It does racetrack patterns over pane field. You might not have anything showing on your flight plan. I don't know what you've been doing earlier in the day. We're going to come back a little later today, and I will build a complete flight plan and show you how that's done. Okay? Notice here with the flight plan exposed, one of the menu buttons now says navigate, and it's a gray button, turns it on or off, right? If Bob were to turn navigate off, we still have the flight plan, but there's no waypoint defined, right? Because it's not currently navigating. If he turns it back on, it'll remember, okay, this is the leg I was supposed to be flying, that's where it's going to go. And by the way, later on when I talk about the HSI, you remember, if you have an active flight plan, you would like to have a needle that tells you how to get there. We haven't talked about how to turn that needle on or off. I'll do that later. But I will tell you, even if you have the needle defined over here, if you turn off navigate, the needle goes away. It can't navigate if it doesn't know where you want to go. So that's part of that cockpit resource management. There's a couple steps you always have to follow to make sure you have a needle on your HSI. One of them is to make sure your flight plan is navigating if this is your intended source. There's a button here called FPL menu. You'll see that later when I build the flight plan. That's where we get to choose things like adding a waypoint or deleting a waypoint or clearing the flight plan out. Okay? So, oh, by the way, I hadn't talked about this before, but in this current state, button 1 says exit. It doesn't say back, it says exit. The reason we use that term is because currently we're looking at what I call a dialog box or a list. It's not one of the standard screen portions, the flight instruments, engine, and map. It's not one of those. So the very first step is to get back to our normal screen display. So I want to exit from this special box. So that's what happens when we press that button. Exit, it goes away. We're still on that same menu. So we haven't gone back anywhere yet. So we covered those first 4. Next, look at button 6, says layers. I would have you press the layers button if you would. We have a button that's turned gray, so it's an on-off feature, and it says terrain. Yes? So turn that off. What happens when you turn terrain off? The map becomes a lot less interesting. Now you just have a black background. I'm not showing you the topographical terrain presentation. The black means I'm not telling you anything. Now you still see red and yellow. I'll talk about that, but that refers to proximity alerting of the terrain. The red and yellow terrain, in the old maps we said there be dragons. You don't want to go there, right? Because it's higher than you. So now turn the terrain back on. Look at the next button. It says VFR. Press that. What do you think you get there? You're going to get a sectional, VFR sectional. Now, the terrain just comes with SkyView. The rest of these, VFR, IFR low en route, IFR high en route, those three layers are part of the chart data that you have to purchase on an annual subscription for $99. There's no cost for the data that we put on our computer-generated map. But if you want to see chart data, and by charts, again, it's VFR sectionals, IFR high and low charts, and then the instrument procedures and taxi diagrams, all part of that data set.
Are Canadian charts included?
We don't currently have Canadian charts. You have to talk to the Canadians because it's handled through a private company and it's obscenely expensive to get that data. For you, for a one-time fee of X number of thousands of dollars, I can probably get you a copy. Yeah. Okay, so VFR. Now, some of you are saying, oh, great. I've been flying with a sectional all my life. I want this sectional on the screen. Oh,
It's too busy.
we got the VFR charts. You're saying, ah, great. Finally, something I recognize. I promise you, if you turn this on and fly for 20 minutes with this on, you're going to turn it off. It's familiar, but it's too busy. There's too much information on. And if you turn it off, go back, press the terrain button for me, Bob. This map is very well thought out, and it's just easier to see. Now, there may still be times when you say, oh, you know what, I want some detail that's not reflected on this map. Pull the sectional up because you're used to finding that, finding the VFR corridor over SeaTac, things like that. But I don't think you're going to want to fly with this continuously. There's another reason that many pilots think that they want the VFR charts on here. And many pilots today still think that based on the FARs, you have to have a current copy of the sectional when you fly. You remember most of us, when we learned to fly, you had to go buy a new sectional every 6 months, right? And that's not what the FARs say. You have to have all the current aviation data that's at your disposal. Because the data, turn that off for a moment, Bob. The data that we use to generate all the objects on this map comes from a text data file from the FAA, and it's updated every 28 days. And if you update that file on the 28-day cycle, you have all the same information, the same relevant information that you would find on the sectional. It's the same data file, in fact, that the cartographers use to generate the sectional. It's the same data set. So if your only reason of having this on screen is the sectional on screen is because you think the FARs require it, no, it's not true. So if you like looking at the sectional, that's great. I think you'll be doing yourself a disservice if you don't explore using the computer-generated map that we provide you. If you're flying IFR, of course, you have access to the high and low IFR charts as well. Okay, the last item on here says weather. Press that one. It's an on-off feature. Now, the map didn't change dramatically until we zoom out. Can you zoom out a little bit, Bob? Notice how the normal terrain is a little bit muted. And that's one way we tell you that the weather data is overlaid. Now look over here. Here, this bright yellow, fairly bright yellow, orange, and red. And notice how the edges of those colors are kind of smooth, rounded. That's weather data, precipitation from Doppler radar. And that data comes into SkyView from the ADS-B receiver. Toggle the weather button on and off for a moment, Bob. Just press it to turn it off. So there's the normal terrain color coding. There's weather. Can you see here on the map on the right, we still have red and yellow terrain. That's terrain that's very high above us. And you need to learn to distinguish between the red and yellow that denotes weather versus the red and yellow that's terrain proximity. The differences are the weather data is pretty bright. The terrain is kind of muted. The edges of the terrain data tend to be more jagged in the way that terrain contours. Now let me zoom out a little bit more. There's something else I want you to see. Notice this kind of magenta shading out here? And notice how it's outside the boundaries of the US? That magenta is areas for which you have no weather data. Doesn't mean there's no weather out there. It means I don't have data. Could be you just turned SkyView on and it hasn't gotten the data update. The ADS-B system doesn't actually transmit data out here over the ocean. Most of you aren't going to be flying out there. But importantly, look at this. Here in eastern Oregon, and if I zoom out even further, there's areas down here. Because of the line of sight nature of the ADS-B ground stations, there are areas where you might not have, might not be receiving data. So the magenta means not that there's no weather, it means you don't know whether there's weather there. So just be aware of that. Now, so this is the graphical weather presentation. I'll circle back in on the information tab for the airport. There's a way to see the text version of the weather data, METARs and TAFs and winds aloft. Okay, let's turn weather off. And then where do I need you to go? Back. That takes us back to the map menu. There's a button here that actually is labeled map menu. I've got some slides in a little bit that will show you there's lots of different things you can configure about how your map is displayed. We need to declutter the map. The further you zoom out, the more map area you see, the more airports that are displayed. And at some point it just gets too bloody cluttered. So we dynamically remove stuff from the display as you zoom out. Now, I think most of you will find you probably don't need to change those settings. We've done a very good job over time of getting feedback from customers and choosing good default values. But I got a call from a guy in Australia. He said, Kirk, when I leave my home airport and I zoom out far enough to see the next closest airport, they're all gone. Well, his next closest airport was 400 miles away. And that's beyond the level at which we start decluttering airports. So he had to modify his zoom level if he wanted to see his friend's airport. Most of you aren't going to have to do that. We think our default settings are pretty rational, but they're there for you to change if you want. A whole host of other things about the map, and we'll talk about some of those. Okay, I'm done talking about the map menu for now. So where do I need you to go? Back on the main menu. Did you all get there? Button 1 says PFD, right? So now let's select button 4, autopilot. So one press, and then hang out there for a little bit. Now let me remind you all, there are 2 menu systems available for the autopilot. A simplified, what we call a control scheme, but you can think of it as a menu. Simplified menu and the expert menu. And what you're seeing here and on all of your displays should be the simplified menu. Okay, so you should see button 2 says off. I think you can deduce what that's going to do. If the autopilot's on, it's going to turn it off. Next button's blank. Now notice you have 4 buttons. We'll circle back and go through these. You'll see them in action when the flight simulator's moving. But look at those 4. The first 2 says track plus alt. If we press that button, it would turn the autopilot on, and it would follow the track bug, and it would hold your altitude. You need to turn that back off because of the servos. So that's the simplest way to engage the autopilot. If you turn that on, it's just going to follow the track bug and the altitude bug. You change the bug values, it'll follow along. Now on your screens, I don't know whether they turn green on your screens. When Paul turns his on up here, notice that the button turns green. Uh-oh, I better get the airplane in control. There you go. When Paul turns on track plus altitude, instead of turning gray, I talked about on-off features always being gray. In regards to the autopilot itself, green means the autopilot is engaged. That feature is engaged and it's controlling the airplane. You'll see more about that later, but go ahead and pause that or turn that off. The next button says HSI plus alt. What does that mean? Instead of following the bug, it's going to follow the HSI needle. Okay. Now notice the difference between these 2 labels right now. One, the letters are bright white, and you saw that he could push that and something happened. This button, the letters are gray, and if Paul or Bob pushes that button, nothing happens. Why? He's trying to tell the autopilot to follow the HSI, and I have no HSI needle. So that feature, in computer parlance, we say that's grayed out, or it's not selectable. And this will always be unselectable until we do the proper things to get an HSI needle shown. So we'll circle back and see that. That's a really important lesson, by the way. So I'll snap my fingers to wake you up when we get to that part. The last 2 features I'm going to talk about a little bit more, but level feature, the autopilot's going to get things level for you. 180 degrees, it's going to go the other direction, right? So later on, I'll demonstrate how those work. Enough of the autopilot menu for now. Where do I need you to go? Back. So now, pressing button 5 for transponder, the first thing you need to look at is buttons 2, 3, and 4. And one of those buttons is gray. Those are the transmit modes for the transponder. Do I need to define those for you? Do we all know the difference between ground mode, on, and ALT? Yes, no? You all know that? Okay.
Select on speed.
I'll come back to that. Press it. Now the transponder is in SBY, standby mode. Yellow means it's in a suspended state. So that's how you get to standby mode. Okay, so I'm going to put the transponder in the ALT mode. Button 5 says code. Go ahead, you take control now. Since it's not timing out, you can fly again. Press the code button. Now you've got the 8 numeric digits necessary to set a transponder code. So go ahead and put in a code of, I don't know, now that screen does time out. You saw that. Now Bob put in 1200. I'd like you to put in a different code for me. Go into the code menu and put in 34, no, I want you to put in 3522. Okay, so that's a trick, right? There's no backspace key. Did you all see that? He got in 2 digits and he said, oh, I made a mistake, I need a different digit. There is no backspace key, no erase key. In that state, you only have 2 options. Either you put in the rest of the code, so he put in 34 and I said I wanted 3522. So you could just finish the code, 34 whatever. So let's do that. Code 3422. He completes the code, now he immediately goes back into the code menu and puts the right code. And you're going to say, well, Kirk, for that period of time, ATC says the wrong code. They see that all the time. What about the old transponders where you had to turn a knob for each number individually? Every time you click the knob, the code on their scope would change. So that's not a problem for ATC. You just need to promptly get back in and put in the right code. The other alternative is if you just have brain lock, 3422, oh, it's supposed to be 35, whatever, I didn't even hit the right numbers. If you stop doing anything, this will time out, I think we'll see. And by the way, it didn't get a complete code, so it reverts back to the prior code. In fact, it never even started to change the code. It doesn't commit a change to the transponder until it sees all 4 digits appear. So that's the other way, is just stop doing anything, it'll time out. So now notice button 6 says VFR. Currently we have a code on ours set to 3422. If you press the VFR button, what do you suppose happens? 1200. But notice it's an on-off button. So if you were to turn that off, what's it going to say up here? Because the VFR menu option is an on-off feature, when you turn it off, it reverts back to your prior discrete code. Why would you use that? For VFR, you wouldn't. The only time in VFR flying when you would end up with a discrete code is if you ask for flight following through Class Bravo airspace or whatever. So they will give you a discrete code. But when they say, okay, I'm done with you, I'm too busy, or you're clear of my airspace, squawk 1200, you might be tempted to do this, press VFR. So you're squawking 1200, trust me, we really are squawking 1200, but your intent is to operate VFR. If you later inadvertently hit that button, you intended to ident or something and you inadvertently turn it off, you're now squawking a bad code. So if your intent is to operate for long duration VFR, I would beg you to turn this feature off, go into the code menu and punch in 1200 discreetly. So there's no chance of you flying around with the wrong code. So we'll turn that off, go here, and put in 1200. If you're flying IFR, it's entirely common, maybe you have an interim stop at an uncontrolled field. So they may say, contact Unicom, squawk 1200, call me back on this frequency when you relaunch. When you call them back, they've reserved that code. They'll give you back the prior code you had, maybe. So this feature gives you a way to squawk VFR and then return to your prior code. Okay, we're done with the transponder menu. Where do we need to go? Back to the main menu. And if you're on the main menu, you should see button 6 says Tools. So choose that. I'm way behind on my slides. There we go. So Tools menu, not much on there. Button 2 says Timer. I have a talked about the status bar at the top. At the middle of your screen, at the very top, there's a timer, and it should have a clock value in there. It's not showing on mine, again, because of a quirk with Flight Simulator. I think all of yours have a time code at the top, don't they? And it would say either UTC, oh, none of yours do. Okay, you just have dashed lines. Oh, some of you have it, some of you don't. Oh no, yours labels change because you press the timer button. If you haven't done anything, it either has a real time code that comes from GPS, or in my case, because it doesn't have data, it's got dashed lines. But in your airplanes, trust me, it'll always say time. You have to choose, does it show Zulu time or UTC time or your local time? You define the hour offset in setup so that it knows how to show you local time. Boy, you probably want to buy a second display for me just so you can have UTC and local time, because who remembers the offset from season to season? I don't. So yeah, I can make you a deal on a display today. Okay, so now we're on this tools menu, button 2 timer. If you press that button, the code up here changes. We've now turned that into a stopwatch timer, and it can either count up or count down. You can reset it to the last value. The 2 knobs become minutes and seconds. I don't want to cover how to use this today, but you can explore it on your own. It's defined on the manual, but I think if you experiment with it on your own, you'll quickly deduce how it works. Probably not going to use it if you're flying VFR. Okay, so go back for me, Bob. Now, go back into the tools menu for a moment. None of you see it on your screens. It showed up a moment ago. There's a button over here that might say video. None of you see it. That reflects if you've purchased one of our video adapters. Our latest version of SkyView supports showing a video feed on the display. So you must first purchase from us a video adapter that plugs into one of the USB ports. Then you connect a camera source like this GoPro camera or something. If you do that, you'll see a button here. And when you press that button, it turns on the video feed. The first thing that happens is your entire screen is replaced with the feed from the camera. Once you've done that, you can go to the screen layout button, which we haven't talked about, and then say, wait, I need something more than the video. I need to see my flight instruments, or my engine, or my map. The video can either be 100% of your display, or you can have 50% of the screen dedicated to the video, and the 50% dedicated to either instruments, flight instruments, engine instruments, or map. Okay, those are 2 options. So why would you want a video camera? Well, maybe you fly a tail dragger and you'd like a taxi camera so you don't taxi over a kid's tricycle or something. Maybe you're flying a tow plane and you want a camera on the airplane behind you, or flying formation with the Blackjack Squadron and you want any number of reasons. A lot of backcountry pilots are hankering for one of the infrared cameras that are available. Now they're still pretty expensive, but they're coming down, $3,000 or $4,000. But I'll tell you what, if you've ever come close to touching down with a moose or an elk on the runway, or one of the first mall I owned, I bought from a farmer in East Texas, and he picked me up at the local airport, and we flew into his field at dusk. There's a lot of cows around. I would like to have an infrared camera. So nice feature if you use it. That's where it would be. Okay, back to the main menu. Okay, we have one more menu to cover, screen. Press button 7. Now before you press anything else, let's review. You got 3 buttons that are gray, and look at the labels. It says PFD page, primary flight display page, EMS stands for engine monitoring system page, and map page, and they're all gray. Gray means it's an on-off feature, right? So you can turn them off. So now, go start pushing those 3 buttons willy-nilly. Now I really want to hear all those buttons clicking, because I need you to explore this on your own and get a sense of how it works. When you turn the button black, the associated page goes away, right? Mm-hmm. Can you turn all 3 of them off?
No.
Why is that? We believe you'd find it disconcerting if the SkyView screen went completely black. I hope you don't ever see that in flight.
Well, you can turn it. You can turn them all off. Just hold button 1 down.
Yeah. Paul was paying attention in that first session. You can make them all go black, but you shouldn't oughta.
Why would you?
That's right. Okay, so now configure it so that you have PFD and map turned on and the EMS page turned off. So get it so that the EMS page is black. Now look at button 7. It currently says layout. Start pressing the layout button, and you have to press it repeatedly. Don't just hold it, but press it. Keep pressing it, and you should see a pattern develop. You can swap the map left and right. You can make the map occupy 50% of the screen or only 40%, but there's a bit of a pattern there. Now turn the map page off and turn engine on. Now go back to the layout button, so turn off map. So you got PFD and engine, press the layout button and keep pressing. You should see a pattern here. Now in this case, the engine can be 50% wide or it can be 20% wide. It can't be 40%. We've just, for whatever reasons, we define those constraints. Now put the map, turn the map back on so you have all three showing. Press the layout button. Keep pressing it because you got to figure out the pattern. It'll start to make sense. You see how things are changing? So here's my standard question, 2 answers. How many different possible screen combinations are there? I used to know for sure, it used to be 19, but then we added the 40% wide map. So the real number is, I don't know, 27 or whatever it is. I figured out on an airline ride once. So that's the digital answer, right? 27, let's say. So what's the analog answer? How many screen layouts are there? Too darn many. Too many. In practice, you're going to distill it down to just a handful of layouts that you commonly use. And if you have a single SkyView display, you use a couple different layouts. So let's say I do have, let's say I have one SkyView display in my airplane, and for whatever reason, Bob likes to fly with the map on the left. I've never met anybody that likes that, but we're going to leave it like that. He says, you know what? When I have all 3 things showing, I want the map on the left, flight instruments on the right. But when he turns the map off, he's going to say, I like the flight instruments on the left, but I like the engines to be really small. That's great. Now what happens when he turns the map back on? Is it going to stick the map in on the right? No, if you turn the map back on, it remembers for 3 items, you like them in this layout. When you have just PFD and engine, you like them like this. So once you've spent some time flying with SkyView, you'll distill it down to 2 or 3 or 4 different combinations you like. And most of your interaction with this menu will simply be turning things on and off. I'm in cruise and I don't need to see the engine anymore, maybe. Or I don't need the map right now because I'm in phase 1 and I shouldn't be looking at the map because I'm orbiting the airport. I should just be looking at instruments and engine. So mostly you'll use this menu to turn things on and off. Cockpit resource management. You just have to find out what works for you. If you have 2 SkyView displays, you've got a lot more flexibility and you'll find yourself using slightly different layouts in that case. And if you have a 7-inch display, you'll find yourself leaning forward like this.
Yeah, with your magnifier.
No. Yeah, we get that question a lot. You know, the 7-inch display is pretty small. Can I increase the size of the fonts? When we first launched SkyView, some of the fonts on the 7-inch display were quite small. But in response to all that feedback, we went back and surveyed all avionics in the marketplace, and we modified our 7-inch display to make sure there's no font on that screen that's smaller than the smallest font used out in all the industry. If it's still too small for you, then you need glasses like me. But frankly, I have to wear glasses in the cockpit anyhow to read my phone and read the charts and whatnot. I've flown with both, and the 7-inch display, if you have limited panel space, it still is well worth its money because it still gives you access to all these features. Okay, so screen layout, I think we covered all that. So let's go back to the main menu. Oh, I missed a slide here. This just shows you the various combinations of how things can be configured. But certain elements can shrink to the 40% size. You don't need to remember the numbers. Just know that you need to explore it on your own and find out what works best for you in your cockpit. So now we're going to focus on the moving map. And I got some slides in a little bit to show you more detail about those other